All right, so here I'm ambitious tonight. I'm going to try to talk a little less comprehensively about the content of these chapters to try to get through as much of this, hopefully all of it, as possible, but actually do it justice at the same time and not just hurry up and try to cram the last 50 minutes of material into 5 minutes. So, yeah. We know Isaiah chapters 1 through 12 are a what for the book? A microcosm. You all were waiting for Aaron the Phantom to answer for you, right? And of course, that gives us a drill down of how the rest of the book is going to kind of play out with respect to the sequences of judgment and restoration cycles in there, all the language built into it that the prophet is speaking. And of course, many of those oracles are probably coming from later portions of his ministry. But one thing that we're also having to remind ourselves when we're reading this book is that this is like a tapestry, a quilt. Many of these oracles have been moved around in the sequence of when they were spoken, and we might not even really know when and at what point Isaiah and his ministry may have originally uttered these words, but here they are, where they are right now to help us understand what the grand design of this entire scheme, I won't really call it a narrative because it's not really a narrative. There's a few sequences in there that give us a drill down of some event that's happening in real space and time in the life of Isaiah and these kings that he prophesied under the reigns of or whatnot. But what God is doing both locally and cosmically, right? So then after we get past chapter 12, we get 13 into 24, and with respect to that, 23, got to remind myself, we're looking at all the nations that surround tiny Judah, and God is systematically bringing judgment on every one of them such that they are left with the one inescapable conclusion: God is the crutch they need to lean on. He's the one who has always been their rock and refuge. He's the one that they are supposed to be hoping in, and not any of these nations that they would dare try to craft alliances with. But as we get past 23 and we look on to 24 through 27, that's kind of what we're getting a picture of, is that not 24 through 24, 24 through 27. As we take a picture or a synopsis of some of these other nations, that's what we discover here. And we'll get into a little bit more of that tonight because that's carrying us on past this sense of God taking the judgment spoken of in chapters 13 through 23 to these nations and then applying it in a more cosmic direction in chapter 24 through 27. 28 all the way up through 30-ish is looking at now stepping away from the cosmic frame of God's judgment but restoration of all things. And of course we realize too that's setting an anchor point for what Isaiah is going to be speaking about toward the very end of this book when he speaks about a renewed creation visualized as a new Jerusalem. And of course John will pick up on that in the New Testament, closing out the entire canon of Scripture with what appears to be a golden gilded city coming down out of heaven for God and man to dwell in together. And all of this represents a completely renewed cosmos, heaven and earth united together as one. Now we're stepping back from the cosmic frame and we're looking here at some of the schemes and the plans and the treachery that's going on in Judah at the time in which presumably Assyria is about to come down and bring a torrent of judgment. Now remember, just because Judah is not completely done away, we always have to keep in mind that frame of reference of the devastation that's caused. 46 cities, all fortified, destroyed by Sennacherib. And he's still mopping up the mess of his most recent bout of carnage when he's sending his three most important commanders, Rabshakeh, Rabsaris, and the Tartan, to the gates of Jerusalem to tell this city that's shut up in fear because of what they have seen over the many months that Sennacherib has been doing this, that he has all but conquered Jerusalem, or Judah at this point, right? And Jerusalem is just the last little prize before they are completely done in. So they are literally just a breath away from total annihilation when God shows up and delivers them at the last possible moment. It really is like the Israelites being on the western edge of the Red Sea and the Egyptians at their back, the sea to their front, and they have nowhere to go. There's no possible way to escape. And then God shows up, right? So, before we get into that historical sequence of Isaiah, he's giving us a picture of what's going on in the city. some of the political intrigue that's happening with respect to discussions amongst counselors, nobles, and whatnot, emissaries that's going to be leaving the city and going down to Egypt and try to concoct an alliance. And we recognize, as we're trying to piece together the historical synopsises from other parts of the scriptures, that Hezekiah, while he is a great king and he starts off well, he wants to honor the Lord. He's trying to clean up the horrible mess of his father Ahaz and restore proper worship to Yahweh, cleanse, beautify, restore the temple and whatnot. Yet Hezekiah is also politically maneuvering in a way that's rather foolish, because he doesn't demonstrate complete total alliance and allegiance with the Lord. He's leaning on other kingdoms. He's taking a bite of the Egyptian apple. And because of that, God is going to chastise him. And he'll do it again after his illness and his recovery, when Babylon comes to town and offers him something else. All right. So, with that in mind, let's get into this. Read the first 4 verses of chapter 29. So, like always, we've got subtitles. What are we supposed to do with that? That's right. We don't look at it. Because for several chapters now, on the back side of that corridor of Isaiah 13 through 24, or 23, we had so roughly 17-ish onward. We've got several places that Isaiah is speaking about with code terms, and he's seemingly continuing that pattern here. So, woe to Ariel, the city where David camped, which would make us pause, hold our chin, cock up one side of our mouth, look off into outer space and wonder, the city where David camped. I think I may have an idea, but not sure. Again, we're not paying attention to the subheading. Continue year after year, let the festivals recur. I will oppress Ariel, and there will be mourning and crying. She will be to me like an Ariel, and I will camp in a circle around you. I will besiege you with earth ramps, and I will set up my siege towers against you. You will be brought down. You will speak from the ground, and your words will come from low in the dust. Your voice will be like that of a spirit from the ground. Your speech will whisper from the dust. So, to understand the word Ariel, have to take it back to the Hebrew, which means lion, but it could also mean lioness of Yahweh. All right, so we're told, as means of qualifying this in the second line, this is the city where David camped. Okay. So, immediately we understand that David comes from what tribe? Of all the tribes that we have any mention of with respect to the standards that they carry, while it doesn't say this in the Torah, what was the image on their standard, we do know from other historical references that there was a particular image that marked out Judah distinctively that comes from Genesis chapter 49. And Jacob has now gathered his sons, the patriarchal heads of all these families, to tell them what will befall them in the last days. And when he gets to his 4th-born son, Judah, he speaks about Judah as a what? A lion crouching down, right? So what becomes the image on their battle standard? A lion, right? And of course, this would be a name, presumably, that David carries out with him. I'm sure he didn't give it to himself. I would be quite confident that many of the men who surrounded him and saw this man's conduct and character in battle would have called him such, which gives it all the more significance when we get to Revelation and we're told that Jesus is the Lion of Judah. All that to say, though, if we're thinking about Judah, David, and whatnot, then what about this city where David camped? If it is Jerusalem, but we have to throw that out there as a potential contender, then what about Jerusalem's story from its earliest mention in Scripture all the way up to this moment would make us think that this potentially could be Jerusalem, a city where David camped? Let's just throw out all the mention of it in the story of Melchizedek, but it next becomes a place of prominence after the conquest era. It's mentioned there again in the book of Joshua, here in 2 Samuel 5. What goes on in 2 Samuel 5? David is exalted as a king of a unified, or the king of a unified Israel, and his first order of business is to go do what? Claim a capital, which happens to be Jerusalem. But is he welcomed as a conquering hero by the people who live there? Who actually does live there at the time? Not them. That's so true. Jebusites, right? And they even come up with this little poetic form of mocking David, speaking about how the blind and the lame would stand a better chance at finding their way into the city than he would. So then he gives an incentive to the first person who's able to get into the place. He will make him the commander of his armies. By de facto, at this point, it's been his nephew Joab, but then he wins that position by being that valiant warrior. And before the day is out, or at least that's the way it's kind of framed up in 2 Samuel 5, David has his capital city. So he camped against them, all right? So we're thinking about Jerusalem being laid under a siege of sorts, although it's quite a brief one, by David, and they wind up conquering the city. Well, notice the rest of the language it's given here in these 4 verses. Continue year after year, let the festivals recur. So that kind of gives us a picture of what? Well, the fact that the cycles are continuing on. Keep doing what you're doing. Let nothing change. Because if it hasn't changed you by now, it probably won't. Nothing will stop. Nothing's going to change. And then he speaks of him besieging them. So if he's going to besiege Ariel, which is the lioness of Yahweh, the city where David camped, that he carves out as his capital, which must then be Jerusalem, what is God saying he's about to do to Jerusalem? He is going to bring a siege against them. But he is not just warning them in a dire sense by saying this is coming, but then softening that blow with, but I'm going to protect you. He's saying he's leading the charge. He's the one that's orchestrating this conflagration. And so then he goes on to say, you'll be brought down. You'll speak from the ground. So in the sense that you've exalted yourself, you're going to be humiliated. And their humiliation will seem like death. What, as a context clue, don't just consider the words that I put in bold here, but all of this verse, what is the context clue that makes it seem as though this humiliation will be so devastating it will seem like death? Okay, we got a woe here.
Speak out of the ground.
Speak from the ground, which carries us back to what story and what picture? What about the next line right after that? Your words will come from low in the dust. So who was brought down to the dust? Comes from the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Right. Exactly. The serpent, though he is not killed, he is given a death sentence, right? So the point is, though, is that you can be humiliated no lower than that. And then right after this, Adam is told that he will return to the dust. The dust is going to become the serpent's food. He'll feed on death because death is the place where the man will go back to. He will be consumed by death, is perhaps a better way of saying it. So, and again, when we get the full picture of how God is going to orchestrate this and he's going to besiege Jerusalem, Jerusalem is not the first target. Jerusalem is the last target of Assyria. Judah is all but dead at this point, right? So again, quite a devastating sense of humiliation. Verses 5 through 8. Your many foes will be like fine dust, and many of the ruthless like blowing chaff. Then suddenly, in an instant, you'll be punished by the Lord of armies with thunder, earthquake, and loud noise, storm, tempest, and a flame of consuming fire. All the many nations going out to battle against Ariel, all the attackers, the siege works against her, and those who oppress her, will then be like a dream, a vision in the night. It will be like a hungry one who dreams he is eating, then wakes and is still hungry, and like a thirsty one who dreams he is drinking, then wakes and is still thirsty, longing for water. So it will be for all the many nations who go out to battle against Mount Zion. All right? So, speaking of their foes, their enemies, being like fine dust, the ruthless, blowing chaff. So, obviously, fine dust has a tendency to do what? When you stir it up and you see it floating against the light, what's it bound to do after it starts to meet gravity? Settle. It's going to settle back down. So the fine dust of their foes is going to settle out over top of them, right? And it's going to blanket them almost in the same way. Think of blowing chaff in the same concept. So fine dust powdering, think of that in quotations, against Judah. Blown chaff swept against them, because he says, then suddenly, in an instant, you're going to be punished. So they'll settle out on you. In other words, think of this from the precipice of the plateau of the city itself. When you see the very thing he just described in the preceding verses, siege towers, siege ramps, these are things that have to be constructed far away and brought near or constructed on site. So a siege does not necessarily start within an instant. It starts more or less over the period of a fortnight, because you see the enemy out there, but you are virtually powerless to do anything as they are bringing their ramparts, bringing their siege towers close to you. You know that you're stuck here until either someone comes to relieve, or you somehow gain an upper hand, or eventually you wind up having to cave in. Right? So with that, suddenly God is going to bring punishment against them. And notice the words here: thunder, earthquake, loud noise, storm, tempest, a flame of consuming fire. Outside of tsunami, or zombie apocalypse, is there any other form of punishment, using biblical terminology, that God is sparing them from? No. I mean, all of this is wrapped up in the language of plagues from Egypt, or various other means by which God has devastated Israel's enemies in the past, and he's bringing all that against them. Again, the picture that we're supposed to think of in our mind is, how can anyone survive something like this? They're supposed to be utterly, mortally terrified in hearing these words. So Assyria is going to descend with great haste, and in some ways this kind of does play out literally. When you think about Assyria being cutting-edge armed forces of the day, are not simply coming with just foot soldiers. They're going to be bringing horses, chariots, and when you consider that many mounted cavalrymen, literally the ground and rocks beneath your feet shake. The earth quakes, right? And no doubt a great cloud of dust kicking up behind them. So it seems like a horde of locusts. And then usually many other biblical prophets and poets will utilize that kind of terminology when they're talking about God bringing great judgment against whoever, but in most cases it's Israel and or Judah. So he'll unleash all forms of his wrath against them. And the many nations going out to battle, they'll do all these terrible things. Siege works against her, those who oppress her. But then we get this weird thing at the end of verse 7. It will be like a dream, a vision in the night. So what is something that might enter your head when you read that? All the nations going out to battle. They're going to erect their siege works. They will come to oppress her. But it will be like a dream, a vision. So is this even supposed to happen? Is it possible the prophet is saying this is something that's tentative, but may be something that can be averted? Or is it more or less supposed to be understood in a symbolic way? That's a very good and a very fair question. Anything else that might come to mind? So a dream that seemingly is very real, but upon awakening, it seems to lack all substance in reality, because what was confined to the dream state is there. Thankfully, Freddy Krueger's not real, and while he plagues us in the dream state, he can't come into the waking state and kill us, right? So what was there in the dream state has to stay confined there. But here's the rub. This will be real. We know, because of the way history played out, this isn't just simply a vision that the prophet describes. These events will play out in space and time. So knowing that, whereas we get the ability to cheat, and Isaiah's original hearers did not, because these events haven't happened yet, what are we to make then of verse 8? That these events will, as a dream or a vision, be like a hungry one who dreams he's eating, but when he wakes, he's still hungry. Dreams he's drinking, but when he wakes up, he's still thirsty. What is that supposed to convey? If you...
It's like when you think it's over, but it's not.
Okay. So are you saying that from the vantage point of
Yeah.
the people in the city?
Yeah.
Okay. Possibly. What about if we were to think about it from the vantage point of the attackers?
They're ready, they just ain't have to do it yet.
Okay. So they could be hungry in the sense they're chomping at the bit. They're ready to go. Okay. So if you're one who is hungry, you dream you're eating, are you really eating though? Can the thing that you're eating, you're sitting there with a table 20 feet long and every square inch is covered with all of your favorite foods. And while you're just snacking away, you don't even feel the slightest bit of remorse or guilt or a sense of satiety. You're not full. You can just keep on eating, keep on eating, keep on eating. But when you wake up, what do you still feel? Hungry. There was no substance to it. How can that be, though? From the vantage point of the attackers, what would that seem like? Think of it in the terms of what's really happening here. They are going to attack the city, and the Assyrians will come. But even though they come, what happens in the end of this conflagration when they do eventually lay siege to Jerusalem? Do they get to snack on Jerusalem? God shows up. That angel of the Lord comes, kills nearly 200,000 soldiers. They don't even get to take the first bite, shoot the first arrow. That's what Isaiah said is his comforting words to Hezekiah. Not even as much as an arrow will be shot into this city. So, Judah's attackers will not get what they came for. They will taste, because they will sumptuously fare on all of Judah other than Jerusalem. But they will not devour it. Devour it would seem to mean like you ate it until the last bite, and you didn't stop with the same bit of tenacity you took that first bite with, you took the last bite with. And you're still hungry, bloodthirsty for more. But they won't get to devour all of Judah. They will sip, but they will not consume it to the last drop. They will not be sated. Verses 9 through 12. So stop and be astonished. Blind yourselves and be blind. It's interesting how he keeps oscillating so quickly, almost violently, back and forth between these two extremes, talking about how Assyria is going to come prepared for war, and they're going to get within an inch away from that with respect to Jerusalem, and will have had more than the lion's share of it with the rest of what they looted and pillaged from Judah. But then he speaks about how it's going to, for them, be like a dream, that they were eating, but when they woke up, they didn't eat anything. When they were dreaming and they drank, they wake up, it's like they didn't even drink anything at all. So that's a message of salvation, a glimmer of hope for those occupants of Jerusalem, the place where this siege is going to be mounted against. But then in verse 9, he's going right back to them with these condemning words of, stop and be astonished, blind yourselves and be blind. They are drunk, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with beer. For the Lord has poured out on you an overwhelming urge to sleep. He has shut your eyes, and in parentheses, the prophets, covered your heads, the seers. So if at this point we were wondering, is it possible that he is saying to the Assyrians, stop and be astonished, be blind, right? We know now that's not the case, because it's prophets and seers that he's speaking to with respect to the sense of stripping them from their supernatural prowess, if they really have any. Verse 11, for you, the entire vision will be like words of a sealed document. If it's given to one who can read, and he is asked to read it, he will then say, I can't read it because it's sealed. And if the document is given to one who cannot read, and he is asked to read it, then he will say, I can't read. Confused yet? Okay. So stop and be astonished. An allusion, I think, to chapter 6, because what was Isaiah's commission? He asks the Lord, how long do you want me to go to these people? And verse 10, make the minds of these people dull, deafen their ears, blind their eyes. Let's read that again. You'll continue to preach these words and say what I have given you to say, which includes all of this language of you breaking covenant law, sinning against God, conspiring to do what you want, thinking that he doesn't see, that he doesn't know, that you are free to act as your own agent with respect to geopolitical events. You can concoct your own alliances and treaties, and that frees you up from any of the consequences that our ancestors agreed to at Sinai, that we would do everything that God commanded when he said he would make us a kingdom of priests and his own chosen race, a peculiar people, right? A kingdom of priests to the nations. You'll keep telling everybody of what's going to come consequence-wise, and even pronounce the goodness of the blessings that will come once God does all this. But what will the end result be? Either way, it's a zero-sum total, because their minds will grow dull of hearing it. Their ears will grow deaf. Their eyes will become blind. Otherwise, they might actually respond in faith and see and hear, understand, and then turn and be healed. He's telling them that won't happen, right? So he's just bringing that language forward here in saying that they are to blind themselves and be blind, to not pay attention, basically. Drunk, but not with wine. Stagger, but not with beer. Well, what can make you drunk and stagger if it's not some sort of alcoholic beverage that inebriates you? How then can you become stripped of any sense of caution or apprehensiveness? Seemingly, it's qualified for us in verse 10 when he says, the Lord has poured out on you an overwhelming urge to sleep. Do you think he really means to sleep? If it's not literal physical rest in the sense of shutting your eyes and letting your brain be dominated by your parasympathetic nervous system that just keeps you alive long enough for your heart to beat and your body to breathe, and the processes necessary to make sure that life is sustained until you wake up again. He's not talking about that. What's he talking about?
Not see what they're supposed to see.
Right. Because do you process information when you're asleep? No. Are you interacting in any way at all with reality around you? No. Your eyes are shut, meaning the prophets, and of course these are those court-appointed prophets, those people who, like in Jeremiah's day, claim they're speaking words directly from the Lord, and people esteem them as being prophets. And it's hard for those people to really know who is the right one, because Moses' test was simple, but it takes time for it to actually manifest. The words have to come forth, and then the proclamation has to prove itself true. If it doesn't, the prophet's not vindicated. If he's not vindicated, people have a right to punish him for speaking lies, especially in the name of the Lord. But if what he says comes to pass, they're supposed to venerate this person as a prophet and then listen, because now they know a prophet of the Lord walks amongst them. So God has stripped them of their ability to see anything. They all concoct the same plans and schemes, but it's all leading to the same outcomes. And he's covered their heads, the seers, so they have no vision of the future. Your entire vision will be like that of a sealed document. So if I could teach you to do anything from Isaiah, it'd be this. Love the word pictures. If you can understand the word pictures he gives, you understand probably better than 50% of the book, because he uses a lot of them. So think about that in your mind. It's that simple. Just a rolled up scroll, piece of melted wax in the middle with a stamped imprint on it. You know, if you want to read the contents of this scroll, you're going to have to do what? Break the wax. So the entire vision, what does he mean by vision? He's not talking about the visions of these people who the Lord has shut up their ability to see and cut off access from the supernatural, God's divine counsel. This is the vision that who has been telling them all along? Isaiah. Exactly. So for all that he has given you so far, it's like a sealed document. So it's only meant for certain eyes to read and to understand. For the one who it's given to, he will say, I can't read it because it's sealed. I love how every time I engage with my 13-year-old son, some of the things that will come out of his mouth will be like it was written by Captain Obvious. You know, it's like, duh, buddy. What are we going to do about that now, right? So if you hand someone a sealed scroll and you have the intent of them divulging the information on it and they say, I can't read it, it's sealed, what would you retort with? Open it, exactly. The document's sealed, so it's keeping its important content secretive. These are words expressly from the Lord. The solution to the problem, obviously breaking it open. Then it's given to another one who truly can't read, and he will say, I can't read it. But remember, in the word picture here, I'm the one that's got the scroll that's sealed. I hand it to one who presumably can read, and he says, I can't read it because it's sealed. So then it goes to this guy who can't read, and he says, well, it's worse off for me. I can't read. But,
I can open it, but I can't read it.
yeah. But if he opens the seal, what can he then do? He can't read, but he can give it back to this guy who can read. So the solution still presents itself. Person who can't reading is standing with someone who can. The solution to the problem is still staring us all right in the face. So the big question then becomes, what's the overall implication if the solutions are actually not employed? That's the ultimate consequence. But in this simple word picture here, if there is a message here that you need to know, but you can't read it, you depend on someone who can, but that person won't even open it and take the time to try to read it. And if there's something important there that you need to know that could hopefully warn you against oncoming danger, you don't employ the solutions, then consequences will come. But what does this say about the state of the people in front of you? They're idiots. I mean, you can't really put it any simpler than that. They are dumb. They don't want to know the wisdom.
Can we name them?
They, in essence, have truly become blind. They are suffering the very thing that Isaiah said would happen due to his incessant preaching against them and amongst them. Blind leading the blind. So, verses 13 through 16. The Lord said, these people approach me with their speeches to honor me with lip service, yet their hearts are far from me, and human rules direct their worship of me. Therefore, I will again confound these people with wonder after wonder. The wisdom of their wise will vanish, and the perception of the perceptive will be hidden. Woe to those who go to great lengths to hide their plans from the Lord. They do their works in the dark, and they say, who sees us? Who knows? You have turned things around, as if the potter were the same as the clay. How can what is made say about its maker, he didn't make me? Or how can what is formed say about the one who formed it, he doesn't understand what he's doing? So these people approach me with their speeches. We are very familiar with this because here we have Jesus saying the very same thing of the religious and political leaders of his own day and their relationship with God, which they think is peachy key, when in reality is the absolute converse of that. God is silent to them, and they don't even realize that, as much as he is in Isaiah's day. He's speaking to them through the mouth of the prophet that stands before them, and they reject the message. So this has become what Israel's cultic approach to God has been sadly reduced to, and it's become quite ghastly. They are worshiping God according to the letter of the law. They are given the exact prescriptions of what to bring and when, and they probably are doing that to the T, not missing a dot. We have no indication textually here that it's like the events of Malachi's day, where the people are so oppressed by heavy taxes and lack of crops coming in and disease-ridden livestock that they're just bringing something, and they don't want to take the most valuable animals that are not only good for the food, but also for working, and they really need that at this time, and they just bring the maimed animals because, hey, something's better than nothing, right? We would have every reason to think this is the pristine animals and the finest of the flour and the oil and the wine. Give it all to God as a grain offering, a libation offering, because he is the one who is going to give us his favor while we do all these other things that we're not supposed to do, right? This is what Isaiah's contemporaries say. Hosea will go on to say in Hosea 7:14, you see, they do not cry to me from their hearts. Rather, they wail on their beds. They slash themselves for grain and new wine. They turn away from me. All they have to do is come to me, but instead they would rather be idiotic and cut themselves like the prophets of Baal up on Mount Carmel with Elijah, rather than simply do what I have required of them. And I've told them, I will not withhold these blessings. Moses spelled it out in no uncertain terms for them, but it requires they give me their hearts, and that's not what they want to do. Or he says in another place, put the ram's horn to your mouth. One like an eagle comes from the house of the Lord, because they transgress my covenant, rebel against my law. Israel has the audacity to call out to me, my God, we know you. Israel has rejected what is good. How can they really know God relationally if the very thing that he has wanted from them all along, they starve him of, which again is their hearts? To do the good is to be eating from the right tree, not the wrong tree, not redefining good and evil, tov and ra in their own eyes, but truly walking in the light of God's wisdom and counsel, which again, they have rejected. Or Micah, another contemporary, he says, her leaders issue rulings for a bribe, her priests teach for a payment, her prophets practice divination for silver, yet they lean on the Lord, saying, isn't the Lord among us? No disaster will overtake us. Could you be more delusional? So Isaiah goes on, therefore I will again confound these people with wonder after wonder. Now, hopefully the natural question in our mind should be what? With respect to that phrase, wonder after wonder. Where did we first hear of God using wonders to catch anybody's attention? Egypt, the Exodus story. So at that moment when God says to Moses, I will smite Egypt with all of my wonders, if we are reading that story for the first time and have no idea what's going to transpire, what are we waiting to be elaborated for us? What are the wonders? Now we have another scenario, except it's not Egypt as Israel's oppressors. It's Israel as her own Egypt. Judah has created the circumstance where they need to be purged. And so the question now becomes, what are the wonders going to be? The wisdom of their wise will vanish, right? Perception will be hidden. This is exactly what we just heard from the Lord in Isaiah 28 a month ago when we were talking about that. But nonetheless, he, at the midpoint of that chapter, says this, these things come from the Lord of armies. He gives wondrous advice. He gives great wisdom. But if you will not listen, then what you perceive to be wise will just leach away from you, right? It will not lead you to the fruitful outcome. So these people are scheming, apparently. The question then is, he says, hide their plans from the Lord. What are you thinking?
You can't hide it.
You can't hide it. And better yet, what are your plans? What are you trying to hide from the Lord? And yeah. And now to say that you have things turned around. This is Isaiah speaking to the people. You've got this all mixed up. This indicates their wisdom. This is the way they see it. In our day and time, the vernacular would be, this is their truth. That they can go to these great lengths and hide their plans from the Lord, and it's as if the Lord will not see them, and they can actually get away with this. This is the state of the reality in their mind. But he goes on to make fun of this in this slightly satirical way by saying of a pot formed by the actual maker, how can what is formed say about the one making it, you don't understand what you're doing? Could there be any more of an ignorant statement? I mean, after all, it was the hands of the potter, wet with the water, slicking around the clay until it went from a formless mass, which is the very story that opens up Scripture, and is the legacy of Israel as a newly constituted Adam in a newly constituted Eden space, to say of him, he doesn't know what he's doing. When he has fashioned every curve, he has fired it in the kiln, he has painted it ornately, he has stated or placed it in its stately position for all to see, for it to be the glorious vessel amongst all the nations that has his attention focused on it, whereas no one else does. And yet their question is, you don't know what you're doing, do you? So this is their assessment of God's wisdom. What's that?
Like something to a child.
Right. Man, there is so much good parenting advice that comes from the way God trains his people.
That sounds like culture today, though.
It is.
No, that's the beginning of our culture. Postmodernism right there.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I mean,
Bunch of liberals.
God, you know,
Sorry, I said
oh
that.
God, messed up. I'm supposed to be a woman instead.
Right. Right.
What, you know?
No, you're absolutely right.
This is the same concept here, you know, I mean, the pot can't say to the potter, right, you know.
And it's
You
amazing.
didn't know what you were doing, you made a mistake, so I'm gonna fix it.
Right. And it's amazing how many people are seemingly attempting to try to follow Jesus, but in reading parts of Scripture and being somewhat jaunted by some of the more uncomfortable things of Scripture and hearing things about God's character that just seemingly unsettles them, that from their perspective of what is wise, what is right, this has to be reinterpreted, or maybe this is just something that found its way in the Bible that really wasn't supposed to be there, that describes God in a rather inaccurate way. Because truly this cannot be the all-benevolent God who created the cosmos and man in his image, who does these rather, in their eyes, petty things, right? But in reality, that's not it at all. Our perspective, of course, is what needs correcting. So moving on to verses 17 through 21. Isn't it true that in just a little while, Lebanon will become an orchard, and the orchard will seem like a forest? So here we go again, right? We go from this condemning language back to language of prosperity and beautification, because we go from Lebanon being like a small orchard to now being a bustling forest. On that day, deaf will hear. So again, we're improving. The words of a document. Let me read that to make sure it makes sense to everybody. On that day, the deaf will hear the words of a document. Out of the deep darkness, the eyes of the blind will see. The humble will have joy after joy in the Lord, and the poor people will rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. For the ruthless one will vanish, the scorner will disappear, and all those who lie in wait with evil intent will be killed. Those who, with their speech, accuse a person of wrongdoing, who set a trap for the one meditating at the city gate, and without cause deprive the righteous of justice. So why the emphasis then on Lebanon? Good question. Well, here they are, immediately to the north of Israel. And of course we know they have this beautiful and opulent supply of wood that everybody around them wants. These are the things that Hiram, the king of Tyre, one of the Phoenician areas, it contracts with David and Solomon to give them as a gift to build and beautify a palace and temple when the time comes, right? So of the ancient world, everybody, and even to this day, wants the cedars of Lebanon. So they seemingly are already a bustling forest to have such a supply of wood for the ancient world. But right now they seem just like a tiny orchard. They're going to become even more stately, even more grand than that. But why not use this language of Israel, right? Is God's heart not for his own people? Why talk about these people who are Gentile in relation to both God and Israel? But perhaps one thing that we might miss here is that as far as the biblical record is concerned, from the time that Lebanon comes on the scene, even until this point, one thing has been constant for them. One thing that's well known about them in the ancient world, and that is they are what? The suppliers of the wood, right? So seemingly what's always been and would never change, because if you have,
They've always been an ally too.
at least for a while, until the days of Jezebel, and then it seems, at least as far as spiritual allies go, they left that path, wanting to infiltrate Israel with Baalism. And then eventually, when you get to the words of Amos and his scathing rebuke against Tyre, because there seems to be a time when they came against Israel in some sort of military conflagration, or at least were harvesting slaves from them and then selling them to Israel's enemies instead of restoring them back to Israel. Amos is not so kind to them in his words. But if they have seemingly from the beginning of time all the way up until now had an abundant supply of cedar, and nobody has challenged them on that. Nobody, even the Assyrians, have not really been able to cut into that market and dominate them and just take over that for themselves and oppress and enslave Tyre. Tyre will always, in a sense, or Phoenicia, be able to kind of sit not quite above all that, but just enough to keep their nose out of the water, unlike many of these other kingdoms who get completely consumed by empires like Babylon or Assyria and so forth. But to say that if all of this at this point is like an orchard that's now going to become a forest, what does that say about this area? It's going to blow up. So what does this say in the larger context then of what Isaiah is talking about here? All of this language is speaking about their crazy plans and schemes to try to find a way around God bringing Assyria to judge against them, to rely on other nations through treaties and whatnot, through the sense of their own wisdom, rather than trust and rest in the words that Moses had given them through Torah long ago, deviating from that path rather than wholeheartedly embracing it. And yet, in this moment, God is saying things that have seemingly always been, which from the gates of Eden, that's the way it's always been. Right? Was this not the first test that man had? You've got two trees. Both represent wisdom. Choose the right one. Choose the wrong one. And then everybody after that, and all these great stories and epics, keep choosing the wrong one. But what has been the steady constant will change. That is what is part of and at the heart of God's ultimate redemptive agenda. What has always been, seemingly from the beginning, will change. And it will have a great shakeup. And when it does, what exactly is going to be the outcome? The meaning of the botanical imagery, I think we've kind of got a good concept of with respect to Eden. And then we get all this language about deaf hearing. But notice what is said. The deaf will hear the words of a document. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, exactly. Boom, you're spot on. So the words of the document that hold the vision, they will finally be able to hear it, and not only hear it, but what? Read it, understand it, because we have another qualifying statement. Out of the deep darkness, the eyes of the blind will finally see. We just read those verses that preceded this in this very chapter, being told, stop, be astonished, blind yourselves and be blind. They stagger. God has taken away their ability to be able to see and understand. And again, those who have the document but won't break the seal and can't read it, but now they can. Then he goes on to talk about a different sense of judgment, but it's not focused on Israel or Judah as a whole. Instead, it's focused on those people who are the true bad apples of the bunch. He speaks of the ruthless one, the scorner, those who lie in wait with evil intent. They will all be killed in this era of God shaking things up. So what are we to make of this? In conjunction with the individual and the spiritual transformations of verses 18 and 19. So let's go back and look at that for a second. The deaf will hear. So that's one person having their eyes, because you hear with your eyes, right? Who have their ears opened and their eyes opened so that they can hear and see, an individual transformation. But it builds further in verse 19. The humble, having joy, poor people, now in a more corporate sense, are going to rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. And now we get to verse 20, where after an individual and spiritual transformation, there's going to be a societal one, in the sense that seemingly there is a system in place where people can do these ruthless things. They can scorn, and they can certainly lie in wait with evil intent to harm, malign, molest others. But God is going to do away with that. Amos, again, a contemporary of Isaiah, says this: They hate the one who convicts the guilty at the city gate. They despise the one who speaks with integrity. Therefore, because you trample on the poor and you exact a grain tax from him, you will never live in the houses of cut stone that you have built, and you will never drink the wine from the lush vineyards that you have planted. So this is part of the judgment that he is bringing on them. You have concocted these schemes to enrich yourselves, to have beautifully ornate houses and massive lush vineyards, but you won't live in the house, you won't drink from the vintage that comes from it. How did these people get such lavish houses? Oppressing all of those around them who they could exact money from, right? It's the instance you have in the case or story of Elisha, who has one of the wives of one of the sons of the prophets who has now died, and she comes to him and she exclaims, my creditor or debtor is coming to snatch up my children and sell them into slavery and put me into jail so that I have to pay for the debt that my husband amassed. That's not what the law requires. The law never specifies that you're supposed to do that to your people. If anything, you're supposed to be seeking opportunity to forgive and cancel debts so that everybody can continue to live in this space as if it's the Eden that God carved it out to be. But when you do that sort of stuff to line your own pockets, to get rich, while in the words of Habakkuk, it might seem that the wicked prosper and the righteous only suffer, what is God going to do in the end? His final say is going to completely take that scale and turn it upside down. And the humble will be exalted, and the rich, wealthy, and powerful will be debased. Or Micah, who says, woe to those who dream up wickedness and prepare evil plans on their beds, and at morning light they accomplish it because the power in their hands. They covet fields, they seize them, they also take houses. They deprive a man of his home, a person of his inheritance. But notice what he says here at the end, that those who with their speech accuse a person or who set a trap or deprive those of righteousness, deprive people of righteous justice. These are the false witnesses, accusing people with their speech, crooked lawyers who set a trap using the law to their advantage to try to convict someone of something they didn't do to get what they want from them, or the judges who refuse to yield the proper right just judgment in the end. All of them will ultimately be condemned. So now, to round this chapter out, therefore the Lord who redeemed Abraham says this about the house of Jacob. Jacob will no longer be ashamed and hide his face and his face will no longer be pale. So, another word picture. Think of the color being completely bled out from your face. What kind of scenario or circumstances cause such a reaction on your part? Right. And you're just completely aghast with embarrassment. So to say that this is Jacob then, Jacob is who in comparison to these people? He is their what? Their father. So for him to have this look on his face must mean that he esteems his people's reaction and conduct and character to be what? Shameful, exactly. And when he looks at that, this is what God is going to say about how he is going to change Jacob's perspective of his own people. For when he sees his children, the work of my hands within his nation, they will honor my name, they will honor the Holy One of Jacob, and stand in awe of the God of Israel. So his assessment will ultimately wind up being, as he sees that Yahweh is not finished yet with what he is making Jacob's people into, that when he is done, as opposed to being a people who run from him, they will be a people who honor him. As opposed to be a people who rebel against him at every turn in the road, they will be those who embrace the Holy One of Jacob and again stand in awe of his beautiful wonders, honoring his name. Now this is important because we consider the fact that God speaks first of his name in what context? In all of the book of Genesis and all the stories that we have there, do we ever have God making a reference to his name as if it's something separate from him? Where do we find that at first? Mount what? Yeah, Exodus, exactly. So, having left Egypt, they're at Mount Sinai. There we go. They're at Mount Sinai, and he speaks to them about going to a place, and when they get there, he is going to cause his name to go with them, and he's going to carve out a place where his name will dwell, right? signifying I am with you and I will always be with you. But that's in the larger context of what? What he just did when he brought them as an oppressed people out of bondage into the beautiful freedom of the inheritance that he's about to ladle on them and march them right into as victors. The same language being said here. They will honor his name, right? Because his name, in relation to who he is, manifested himself to be the deliverer, redeemer of Israel, is who he will finally be known as amongst these people once he's restored them. And the Holy One, and that he lives amongst his people. We should never let that escape our attention. This is why it's always important for us to be familiar with the Torah. And if there's one book that really seems to bring that to light the most often, which of those 5 books would it be? That he is the Holy One who lives amongst them. Therefore, be on guard.
Exodus.
Almost. It's your second favorite Torah book, Leviticus, right? Because that's what it's all about. Everything you do, whether we're talking about stuff inside your own tent or house, or whether we're talking about in the tabernacle, this whole camp, everything in it is holy. And so if you fail to conduct yourselves appropriately, then I will bring the same curse I brought on Nadab and Abihu on you. You will feel my wrath and judgment. Here he's saying that they will learn to honor him. In Israel's history up until this point, have they ever really accorded him with that proper status? No. They've not taken into consideration that the fact that they have the Holy One living amongst them, that he has always desired to walk amongst them and be their God and for they to be his people. They've never given that cordial invitation beyond Sinai to this moment. He's saying the finished work will be that very thing. So, anything on chapter 29 that we need to clarify?
Clear as mud.
I love it, man. That's exactly what I was shooting for.
Remember
So,
a few chapters ago, remember he went in there and they were talking about the priests and the prophets and stuff,
Mhm.
and how they was all drunk and stuff?
Yep.
And they wasn't actually relaying the actual messages. Kinda got that out of that.
exactly. And you're making the right connections because he's using the same thing, the same word pictures over and again. And he's not going to be done with that here. So when you start to see those things, and again, that's why it's helpful to try to read the book as much as you can, as not quickly as you can, but keep the flow going. Let the momentum continue to stay high. Otherwise, if you separate it out by too much time, you start to lose those connections, right? But if you're reading it as much as you can together, you start to pick up on those things. Man, I just saw that not too long ago, and you'll realize he's making a connection there. All right. So, first 5 verses. Woe to the rebellious children. This is the Lord's declaration. They carry out a plan, but not mine. They make an alliance, but against my will. Piling sin on top of sin. Without asking my advice, they set out to go down to Egypt in order to seek shelter under Pharaoh's protection and take refuge in Egypt's shadow. But Pharaoh's protection will become your shame, and refuge in Egypt's shadow, your humiliation. For though his princes are at Zoan, and his messengers reach out as far as Hanes, everyone will be ashamed because of a people who can't help. They are of no benefit. They are of no help. They are good for nothing but shame and disgrace. So obviously, who's he talking about here? Who are the they of this? The Egyptians, exactly. So, understand first, to carry out a plan. From Hebrew, the actual rendering of this is to understand that they are taking counsel, all right? So, to say carry out a plan almost makes it sound like, well, we've done the taking counsel thing, now we're going to enact this plan. But in reality, what they are doing is they are sitting down and having this tabletop discussion on what we think the wisest maneuver would be, which would be, of course, to make an alliance, which he says is against my will. But now what we need to understand, too, the word alliance in Hebrew from masakah is to be seen as a veil over the face or a covering, which, of course, is a very bland, generic term which can mean several different things, but the word picture is always the same. Whether it's a small towel covering a bowl to let some dough rise, or whether we're talking about a blanket to cover up a person when they're cold, it's the same idea. The thing underneath it's being completely covered up. So think about that. Between 2 nations, Judah, Egypt. They're going to Egypt for a covering. What? What's that? Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing. And so he goes on to condemn this by saying they are piling sin on top of sin. First, by acting without divine prompting. Did God ever tell them to go and seek a covering from Egypt? So if he did not send that word or message to them by the mouth of a prophet, on whose authority are they making this decision? Secondly, by seeking some other covering than Yahweh. I mean, after all, is that not what God said he would be to them? That he would provide protection that they need against all of their would-be assailing enemies? He goes on to say that they have done this without asking my advice. So they are taking counsel, but not with me. If they were, I would have clearly told them not to do this. How more scathing is the rebuke in the days of Jeremiah when they do take counsel of the Lord, after Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon have come and done their thing and destroyed the city, burned the temple, carted off a hefty amount of exiles, and Nebuzaradan tells Gedaliah and Jeremiah, I'm leaving you here. Gedaliah, you're in charge. And then these people, after a heinous plot to murder Gedaliah, they want to go to Egypt. But they stop long enough to say to Jeremiah, so you inquire of the Lord. And if he says he doesn't want us to go to Egypt and won't bless this plan, then we won't go. That's exactly what Jeremiah says. And they look to him and say, you're speaking lies. They're just like the people that were either executed or deported by Nebuchadnezzar. And then they kidnap the guy and take him off down to Egypt, right? So it's even worse come a century and a half removed from this, when they will take counsel but yet still not listen, in order to seek shelter under Pharaoh's protection. So we understand, again, this is why Torah is important. One of Moses' most poignant statements in Deuteronomy, chapter 23. The Lord your God walks throughout your camp. We just got done talking about how they will embrace him as the Holy One of Israel. But yet, again, we go from this optimistic side of the spectrum and oscillate really violently back to the judgmental side of it, the very pessimistic side of it, because we're now immersed in the reality of the situation again. Their stupidity in seeking another covering other than Yahweh. They are defying the Holy One of Israel, who walks in their camp to protect you and deliver your enemies to you. You come to me, I hand your enemies over to you. I don't make you sweat it out. You come to me, you walk with me, it's a done deal. I'll go before you in battle. You won't have to do hardly anything. I will send hornets. I will send storms. I will send torrents. Whatever. You will know that I am God and I deliver your enemies to you. But instead, you seek Pharaoh. So his protection or his covering will be your shame. I'm your rock. I'm your refuge. But you take refuge in Egypt's shadow. So what will that be for you but your utter humiliation? His princes, that being Egypt, are at Zoan. His messengers reach as far as Hanes. This is where a good Bible map will help, and also a good historical understanding of the time in which he's living. Remember, many, many moons ago when we were covering earlier sections of Isaiah, we were talking about that the time in which Isaiah is prophesying is mostly during the period of the 25th Egyptian dynasty, which means who's really in charge of Egypt? Native Egyptians or someone else? Someone else. Who's the someone else?
Is that southern Egypt, Ethiopia?
There we go. The Cushites, they are the ones, the Nubians. They are running Egypt, both Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, right? Zoan, Memphis, is right up there toward the northern side. So if we're saying their messengers or princes are in these northern cities, then that gives us the picture then of what may seem like a consolidated Egypt under Cushite rule, which means we've got a strong, unified kingdom that hopefully has their stuff together. Resources and armies available to be able to send to our aid. That's what makes this whole Egyptian alliance so attractive, is the idea that if there's anybody in the region who can come and stand at our back and really be a formidable ally against Assyria, it's going to be these guys. But what is Isaiah ultimately saying? They are of no benefit. They're not going to be of any help to you. They literally are good for nothing. All right, so verses 6 and 7. A pronouncement concerning the animals of the Negev. Through a land of trouble and distress, of lioness and lion, of viper and seraphim, because that's what that word is there, for flying serpent. They carry their wealth on the backs of donkeys, and their treasures on the humps of camels, to a people who will not help them. So who did we just read is of no help or benefit to anybody? So that seems to set up the scenario then that if carts, or I should say loads on the back of donkeys and camels of treasures are being carted across the deserts of the Negev, then seemingly where is this stuff going to if it's to a people who are of no help? This wealth is, well, yeah, ultimately it's going to waste, but who is the people it's being sent to? Egypt. So then where is it coming from then? Egypt is the terminal end. Where's the starting point? Who is sending the wealth to Egypt? No.
We just talked
A little
about
further
it.
south, but good guess. Judah, right?
Yeah.
Judah
Now,
is
isn't
sending.
this the time where we went over where Israel was in the microcosm
Mhm.
of the beginning? Was there a point where we talked about where Egypt went to, God sent Egypt to Israel, and they were blessed, and he blessed Egypt.
So that's a
It
little.
was almost the reverse Exodus,
Mhm.
but for Egypt. Is this the same time that now Isaiah is talking about?
So, yes, I would say yes. And the reason why I would say yes is because in Isaiah 19, which first starts off with Egypt's condemnation, ultimately ends in their and Assyria's blessing. But what's happening here is, of course, the forecast is that Assyria is going to come and they're going to bowl through the land. Egypt is not going to be able to stand against them. And Egypt, too, will ultimately be conquered at some point. The Cushites will be driven back. The native Egyptians probably working to sabotage the Cushites' effort to stay in power because they want their land back and think that the Assyrians are their allies in this. All that to simply say that when God's day of restoration and redemption ultimately come, after judgment of all these nations, that these enemies of Israel will join in with them, right? So those words are probably being spoken at a time when Assyria is at a peak dominant point. Egypt is pretending to be an ally to these people, but we'll find out they won't be, and they will come down and ultimately wind up doing something bad. The reason why Egypt is seemingly being condemned in Isaiah 19 is because of the fact they keep promising all these overtures of what they'll do for these kingdoms if they will fight against Assyria. But as he's saying once again, they're not going to help anybody. They're a broken reed. That's exactly what Sennacherib through his Rabshakeh and Tartan say to the occupants of Jerusalem. They are like a bruised reed, and they will stab the hand of anybody that leans on them because they can't help you, so don't think they can. If they would have come already. So hopefully that makes sense. It's being spoken at a time when Egypt could still be a significant player, but they will ultimately prove not to be. So, through a land of trouble and distress. Now, you know, the coastal region of Philistia would be safer. So, if this is Israel right here, and of course that's the kingdom of Judah, this is where Philistia would be, and then ultimately Egypt is way down here. So the Negev, right down here, south of Beersheba. Instead of going through the desert to get down here, going by the coastal road would be much better. We know that even from the earliest stories in Scripture with respect to Israel leaving Egypt. Why did God not send them along the northern road to get to Canaan faster? What was he apprehensive of? That if they faced war, they would turn back, right? So that is the most expeditious route between these two lands. Why aren't they going in that direction? Well, whatever, we don't know exactly why. But even though they are making overtures to a Cushite-led Egypt that touts great aid to all these Levantine kingdoms, not just Judah, but remember, Moab, Edom, Philistia and her 5 capital cities, anyone around this area who is willing to look or put their differences aside and look to the prospect of a brighter future without Assyria being the messy kid who just wants to beat everybody up, that's who they're willing to play ball with. But Egypt is completely worthless. Therefore, I call her Rahab, who just sits. So here's Bible 201.
We think that's 101.
Check on learning.
Yeah.
So Rahab is the name of a Canaanite woman who ultimately winds up betraying her own people for the sake of aligning herself with Israel. We're not talking about her. Who or what is the other Rahab?
Egypt.
Okay. Good. You're thinking about Egypt. Ultimately, Ezekiel is going to be talking about it from that perspective too. But, let's back up a second. Rather than looking at it in the contemporary sense of Egypt and ancient kingdoms, immersing ourselves in this world, this actually reaches way, way back to the ancient primordial past. kind of like before the creation of the world passed. So who is Rahab in that context?
Before the creation of the world.
Now, when I say before the creation of the world, what you're thinking of in your
Before God said let there be light.
before God said, "Let there be light," sure. But in our scientific 21st century Western culture minds, that means there's nothing, right? It's creation ex nihilo. There's just emptiness and void. But we have to remember, in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, there was never such a time. There has always been gods, and before them, there were primordial gods, right? And so with that, there is a time of chaos before organized creation comes forth out of that, and the gods have their hand in playing with the primordial soup mix that was what the cosmos was until they start bringing out the land masses that humans will occupy alongside animals. In this chaotic primordial state, there are creatures who are alive. So, having said that, Rahab in these ancient Near Eastern legends and myths represents what?
Something like that.
Amazing, yes, because they're, in the words of, lazy? Thought he said amazing. No, actually not. It's the thing that everybody fears. It's the totality of chaos. And she goes by different names in different cultures. Tiamat, according to the Babylonians, right? But it's that source of ancient chaos that is always threatening to take over the created order that the gods have brought forth from the primordial chaos for humans, animals, this little terrarium to live in, right? But to say that this is just a Rahab who sits and is being personified as Egypt here, what does that say about them? That Rahab is a monster of chaos. That's what all of these ancient kingdoms would understand her to be, no matter what name they call her by. But who, ironically, will not be unleashing her chaos on anyone, right? I mean, it's like looking at that guy who is 6'5", and he weighs about 320 pounds, and he has like 10% body fat, rippling muscles, and you're thinking, if you just put a pair of boxing gloves on that guy, like he would murder anybody he steps into the ring with. And then the first thing he does when some little 5'5", 155-pound guy comes up to him and just lunges at him, and he holds his hands up like, "Please don't hurt me." You're like, what did I just see? That's what we're talking about here. Egypt can do nothing. She is powerless to take on Assyria. So moving on with verses 8 through 13. Go now, write it on a tablet in their presence, and inscribe it on a scroll. It will be for the future, forever and ever. They are a rebellious people, deceptive children, children who do not want to listen to the Lord's instruction. They say to the seers, "Do not see," and to the prophets, "Do not prophesy the truth to us. Tell us flattering things, prophesy illusions. Get out of the way, leave the pathway, rid us of the Holy One of Israel." Therefore, the Holy One of Israel says, "Because you have rejected this message and have trusted in oppression and deceit and have depended on them, this iniquity of yours will be like a crumbling gap, a bulge in a high wall, whose collapse will come in an instant, suddenly." So, to say go now and write it on a tablet, maybe this could be the very thing that's being referred to in the previous 7 verses. In other words, the fact that they're going down to Egypt and they're trying to concoct an alliance with Egypt, who they know and understand from the words of Isaiah are a powerless ally who will do nothing to help them. And if anything, they're just bleeding wealth and resources away from them. So to write that on a scroll is a testimony against them, right? And he's saying it will be for the future, which means it's standing as something of a statute. This is how you've been, and this is how you always will be. And the indictment against them is that they are a rebellious people, children who do not want to listen to Torah, because that's the very word being translated instruction there. You do not want to listen to Torah, which can, of course, be comprehensively used to talk about all of the Hebrew Old Testament, but in their day and time, that's still under construction. There are several books and scrolls, including Isaiah's works, who are not even written down yet in a way that they can unroll it and know or see it all like we can, right? All they have up until this point is just the chronological history of Moses and the books of the former prophets, starting with Joshua all the way up through some of Kings, which is still working amongst the sources that will eventually be compiled to become Kings. We're not even talking about half the Old Testament at this point. So to say Torah, we're literally talking about the words of Moses, which means the covenant that they agreed to at Sinai. We will do everything the Lord has said. These people do not want to listen to that. And this is what they say, their command to the prophets. Now, of course, this, while we've heard a minute ago, talking about prophets who the Lord has taken their sense of supernatural vision away from them because they apparently are prophesying lies. This seemingly would be those people who are being true to the word of the Lord, as Isaiah is. Remember, he's not the only prophet of the time. He has contemporaries, Amos, Micah, Jonah, Hosea, and whatnot, and even other prophets who remain nameless. Men who are products of generations that have come from the sons of the prophets, going all the way back to the days of guys like Elijah, Elisha, and even Samuel before them. They say, do not tell us the truth. Tell us flattering things. They want nothing of revelation from the Lord. They want that to be bottled up. And it's not so much that they don't want preaching of any kind. They only want the affirmation that comes through innocuous preaching, meaning it's void of any moral imperatives and without the backing of the ultimate absolute moral nature of God.
Everybody gets it.
That's,
Prosperity gospel.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's what we have done and what we have continued to repeat cyclically over thousands of years, even after the ultimate revelation of God in the person of Jesus. So they want no accountability to the covenant they made or to Yahweh's holiness, his distinctive separateness and transcendence from all of his creation, and the fact that he calls them into his holiness to be equally separate and distinct. Not equal with him, but equal in the sense that they remain aloof from the world and above the fray of their schemes, so that they don't get caught up in those machinations to then be consumed by all of that. But that's exactly what's happening. Instead, the word that's translated here, flattery, in Hebrew, literally means smooth. So think about, again, word picture. You got a nice piece of fabric laid out on the table. You work to smooth out every wrinkle, but the slightest little touch, and it all gets messed up. And now you got to go through the effort of straightening it all back out again. They don't want even the slightest little bit of agitation to wrinkle the garment of what their moral sense and imperative is. They want you to tell them only the flattering things. Keep it smooth. Huh? And then they're saying, get out of the way, leave the pathway, rid us of the one of Israel. To say, get out of the pathway is more literally translated, lead us off the path. What is this path you speak of? Again, why Torah is important. Deuteronomy 11, Moses said to them, you see, there will be blessing if you obey the commands of the Lord your God that I'm giving you today, and a curse if you don't obey the commands of the Lord your God and you turn aside from the path that I command you. So this is an allusion right back to that. They're saying, get us off the path. We don't want to walk on that. We've got our own trajectory in mind, right? Leave the path. We don't want the Holy One of Israel walking amongst us. Send him away. We will do what's right in our own eyes. So you've trusted in depression and deceit. That is the new moral standard by which you operate on, and that is going to become their new Egyptian bondage, right? If they are doing what Adam and Eve did in the garden as a new corporate Adam in the new Eden space of Canaan turned Israel now, when Adam stood before the tree right along with his helper and chose Ra over Tov, the wisdom that seemingly stripped him of any sort of connection to God and any measure of submission to his authority and what he defines as Tov and Ra. That's what they seek to do here. And what did that ultimately do to Adam and Eve? Exile, a new bondage outside of the garden. That's ultimately what Israel was being led into here. And like a crumbling gap, a bulge in a wall, this new morality, it will cause them to collapse beneath it. I mean, how can it lead to any other possible outcome, right? I mean, any sort of morality devoid of what God defines as right and wrong is only going to wind up consuming in the end. I mean, how many of you asked the rather rhetorical question when some years ago we were working through the process of both our chief legislative branches or houses in Congress and the Supreme Court systematically dismantling any recognizable definition of what marriage was. And then we were all asking each other, well, what does that mean next, right? If a man can legally marry another man, then how long before a man decides he wants to marry his dog or wants to marry his broomstick? And as pitiful and laughable as that sounds, yet here we are some years later, and we have these kinds of things actually playing out. And it not only is leading to a fracturing of our society, but it's stripping any sense of what society actually means as a definition from our citizens. I mean, you can't live under such a measure of stupidity, right? When anything goes, and when anything goes, yet nothing goes, and you can be condemned on a whim for the most nonsensical of things that you're supposed to take seriously, but yet no one really ever did take seriously before a year ago, right?
Man, what you having in the house is like that, man, married, no.
I don't know. But 14 through 17, its collapse will be like the shattering of a potter's jar, crushed to pieces, so that not even a fragment of pottery will be found amongst its shattered remains. No fragment large enough to even take fire from a hearth or scoop water from a cistern. For the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, has said, you will be delivered by returning and resting. Your strength will lie in quiet confidence, but you are not willing. You say, no, we will escape on horses. Therefore, you will escape, and we will ride on fast horses. But those who pursue you will be faster. 1,000 will flee at the threat of one. At the threat of 5 you will flee, until you remain like a solitary pole on a mountaintop or a banner on a hill. So, for him to say you'll be delivered by returning and resting, this is God's prescription. This is what it's always been, right? National security through repentance and rest. Moses outlines this for them in Torah. You are about to enter into the land. This is where God is giving you your rest. He lays that out in a series of 7s. Whether it's a 7-day week and on the 7th day you rest like God, or 7 years, and at the end of that 7th year you do not plant, you do not harvest, you do not work your animals. Everybody gets a chance to rest, and you live off the land as if you're in a new garden space. Or 7 cycles of 7, and then lead that into the grand sabbatical year of the Jubilee, when everything goes back to its reset point, and everybody gets a chance over 3 years to live like kings off the land, and nobody has to worry about the oppressiveness of debt or sickness and disease, because I will pour out on you blessings unlike anything you can possibly fathom. And when you screw up, you can turn back to me. When you return to your senses, as Moses says, and he even goes so far as to cast this idea that maybe you might even get kicked out of the land. But even if you do, if God treats you like the nations that he's about to use you to bring judgment upon, that he will still be merciful to you and bring you back to this place. It's always been the measure and the recipe for how they are to accord themselves in proper relationship with God. This is what it means to be righteous. National security through repentance and resting in God. But that's not what they want. But remember, Isaiah has said from the beginning, again, this is why it's so important to frame up chapters 1 through 12 as a microcosm. The opening picture of Judah and Jerusalem is a disease-ridden body that is on the brink of total collapse after its compromise comes to its end state. But does God leave it there? No. He closes out the chapter by saying, Zion, Jerusalem, will be redeemed by justice, those who repent by righteousness. We just wrapped up in chapter 28, him saying, he said to them, this is the place of rest. Let the weary rest. This is the place of repose. But again, the indictment is they will not listen. Or earlier in Isaiah 7, right, when he is going to the frantic king Ahaz with his son Shear-Jashub and saying, this boy's name, whose name means a remnant will return, you're frantically checking the defenses of the city and its water supply. This is what God wants you to turn your attention to. Not shoring up resources, instead resting in him. And when you do, God will take care of everything else. But you're not willing. And so, because you might think that you'll escape on horses, what kind of mindset is that? What I mean by that is they're thinking, we will escape because we know this is coming. This storm is approaching the horizon, but we can run away from it. To say that they will escape on horses must mean that they think they have what at their disposal? Not just an abundant supply of horses, but a military, right? That they have the advantage with allies who can supply these things. If we wind up losing in the end, we can escape because we will have Egyptian horses, right? The very thing that Solomon imported into their kingdom to be able to rescue us. They think their strength rests in militarism. But instead, this is what God says will happen. Not only will faster horses pursue you, but tell me where you've heard this before, or have you heard it before? 1,000 will flee at the threat of one. At the threat of 5, you will flee. Somebody said that before in the Bible. It's not Jesus. Who do you think? Wild guess. Again, what's important for the prophets? What do they keep drawing it back to? The principles of Torah. Who wrote Torah? Moses, right? It's what he says again in Leviticus 26, one of those chapters that outline the blessings and cursings of being obedient or disobedient. 5 of you will pursue 100, and 100 of you will pursue 10,000. And your enemies will fall before you by the sword. But the inverse of that would be that if you fail to be obedient, then 5 of you, or 5 of them will cause 100 of you to flee, right? So, just a couple more slides. Bear with me. This one and one more. Therefore, the Lord is waiting to show you mercy. He's rising up to show you compassion. For the Lord is a just God, and all who wait patiently for him are happy. For people will live on Zion and Jerusalem. You will never weep again. He will show favor to you at the sound of your outcry. Here we go again, right? We went from judgment. Those who are going to live through this will be like, 5 of the Assyrians will put you to flight. That's how bad it will be. Again, unleashing the judgment of the curses of Torah. But here God is saying he is waiting to show you mercy and compassion. That Zion will continue to be inhabited. There will come a time when you will never weep again. He will show favor to you at the sound of your outcry. As soon as he hears, he will answer you. The Lord will give you meager bread and water during oppression, but your teacher will not hide any longer. Your eyes will see your teacher, and whenever you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear this command coming from behind you. This is the way. Walk in it. Then you will defile your silver-plated idols and your gold-plated images. You will throw them away like menstrual cloths and call them filth. Then he will send rain for you, for your seed that you may have sown in the ground, and the food, and the produce of the ground will be rich and plentiful. On that day your cattle will graze in open pastures. The oxen and donkeys that work the ground will eat salted fodder, scattered with winnowing shovels and fork. Streams flowing with water will be on every high mountain and every raised hill on the day of great slaughter when the towers fall. The moonlight will be as bright as the sunlight. The sunlight will be 7 times brighter, like the light of 7 days, on the day that the Lord bandages his people's injuries and heals the wounds he inflicted. So, talking about him showing compassion and mercy. Should he show mercy, though, by abating his judgment? There's tons of questions we could ask to this, though, but he just got done talking about him judging them. He's saying, though, he's waiting to show mercy, which seems to suggest if he's going to show mercy, he's not going to bring all these horrid curses on them. But if that's the case, maybe we should ask, should he do that? I mean, after all, if we continue to show our children who are blatantly rebellious and defiant mercy after mercy, what do they ever learn from such things? What kind of character does that forge in them? Is it not? So how can he show compassion through judgment then?
He cares enough to judge them.
Exactly. The same way that we inflict harsh judgment upon our children for the sake of, out of our love for them, wanting to mold their character, right, and purge these carnal desires to act this way out of selfishness and pride and so forth. Right. And if you do, you show your contempt for your child, right? So people will live on in Jerusalem, never weeping again. Going back to Isaiah 25, when he speaks about how on that day he will have this magnificent feast spread out before them, and he will remove the shroud that blankets all the nations. When he demolishes death, he will then wipe away all the tears from every face, right? So he's linking these two together by speaking of this. Judgment coming, but seemingly after that judgment is over and done with, God is going to be amongst them once more. He is going to invite them into a feast in his never-ending kingdom. Now, granted, lots of times separated between the time of his judgment through Assyria and then Jesus coming to actually orchestrate such a thing and then demolish death through his own death. But nonetheless, the picture is still complete. Now, while in the CSB it says he will give you meager bread and water during your oppression, what does that make it sound like? If you had to create the word picture in your head, like he's feeding you a little bit, right? But in reality, the actual Hebrew translation of this would be that he is feeding you bread of adversity and water of affliction or oppression. So in other words, affliction will be your bread, right? Adversity will be your bread. Affliction will be your water. So that means God is going to bring judgment to you, but that judgment will somehow, in a paradoxical way, sustain you. How can judgment, when it's meant to strip away, actually sustain?
He leans on the promise of him. He's fulfilling what he said he would do, and because he's faithful.
Exactly, because he's faithful. And he's faithful enough, so much so that it will be said of him that your teacher, the one who has been guiding you through Torah and these principles that have been embedded as part of my covenant arrangement with you, will now stand behind you, such that when you walk and you're not sure where to go, and your foot may so much as veer a little bit off to the left or right, the voice will come from behind you. No, this is the way. Walk in it, and you will correct your path. That's what the ultimate goal of this is. You will not stray or wander any longer, but you will walk in obedience. And then that, of course, comes in opposition against what was said earlier in this chapter, where they are saying, get out of the way or get us off the path. We don't want to walk on that anymore. But yet when all of this is over and done with, this will be the complete transformation of their character in such a way that this is what they will crave, right? Jacob will indeed be honored by the response of his people. He'll send rain, food, and all that stuff. It's a complete reversal of the conditions of a post-fall earth, a restoration of Edenic circumstances. Streams flowing with water. Think about this, though. That kind of comes on the backside of what is said in verse 19. You will never weep again. So the waterworks here will be completely dried up, and instead it will be turned on elsewhere, such that every mountain and high hill will seemingly have water sources, rivers bursting out from underneath them. And in a dry, arid land such as Israel and Judah is, when rain is collected during times of the year just to have enough to get through the dry season that comes after that, so man and beast can survive, this is nothing short of a new Eden scenario, right? But it's not to say he is topographically terraforming the land such that it will be like this. He is just saying this is what the new creation for you after all of this is done will be like. It will be a reset back to Eden, but in a spiritual way. The moon will be as bright as the sunlight. This is how we know he is not terraforming the earth, because to say that the moon will be as bright as the sun, well, that seemingly would be miserable, because how do you get rest at night, right? For those people who have had to live in places like Alaska where there's parts of the year where the sun never sets, what do you do to have to darken your windows, right? So you can finally shut your eyes and get some rest. Remember what is said in Isaiah 24. The moon will be put to shame, the sun disgraced, because the Lord of armies will reign as king on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and he will display his glory in the presence of his elders. It's not to say the sun and moon will have to be done away with, nor to say that the sun will shine 7 times brighter than it does. If the sun truly shone 7 times brighter than it does right now, what would happen to life on this planet? Exactly. So, hence the understanding of figurative language being used to describe new creation, right? Pays off in Revelation. All right. Well, we got a lot here. We're almost there. We're gonna get it done. Look, the name of the Lord is coming from far away. His anger burning and heavy with smoke. His lips are full of fury. His tongue is like a consuming fire. Wait a minute. Why are we going back to judgment again? It was just all this restoration. How now are we talking about judgment coming once more? His breath is like an overflowing torrent that rises to the neck. He comes to sift the nations in a sieve of destruction, and to put a bridle on the jaws of his peoples, to lead them astray, or the peoples to lead them astray. Your singing will be like that on the night of a holy festival. Your heart will rejoice like one who walks in the music of a flute, going up to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel. And the Lord will make the splendor of his voice heard, and reveal his arm, striking an angry wrath and a flame of consuming fire, in driving rain, a torrent, and hailstones. Assyria will be shattered by the voice of the Lord. He will strike like with a rod. And every stroke of the appointed staff that the Lord brings down on him will be to the sound of tambourines and lyres. He will fight against him with brandished weapons. Indeed, Topheth has been made ready for the king for a long time. Its funeral pyre is deep and wide, with plenty of fire and wood. The breath of the Lord, like a torrent of burning sulfur, kindles it. So, this is talk about the Lord in the form of burning and heavy smoke and his tongue like a consuming fire. I've got the answer on the screen for you, but nonetheless, that should bring our minds back to what? God manifesting himself at Sinai, right? But remember, when we think of it that way, the first step is to make that connection, to see the word picture for what it is and say, oh, just like at Sinai. But why did that happen at Sinai? What was the circumstances that led to that? The exodus of Israel out of Egypt, right? So if it puts us back in that circumstance, then that's what we're thinking of here. He will go on in the rest of this context to speak about how he destroys Assyria. What did he do in the process of bringing Israel out of Egypt? He destroyed Egypt, right? So we think about the whole word picture then, and we understand that it's basically a repetition then of Exodus. And of course, we get very clear connections to such places like Exodus 24 when it's said that he was like a consuming fire on the mountain of Sinai. So there's a reason why Isaiah would use those exact same words, because he wants them to hyperlink the passage. His breath like an overflowing torrent. Remember in chapter 8, it was spoken of Assyria, referenced there as the Euphrates first, and then the very next line qualified by saying the king of Assyria. It would overflow its banks. It wasn't even mentioned about how it would flow through Israel, because the end target was Judah. And it would overflow Judah to the point of coming right up to the neck. So it's almost like they're completely consumed, right? We've talked about that plenty tonight, about how they're almost consumed under Sennacherib, but not totally. But now, this is completely reversed. God's breath is like a torrent. He's unleashing his wrath upon who? In this instance, it's not Judah. It's actually going to be against Assyria. Your singing will be like that on the night of a holy festival. Now, of course, most of these holy festivals will last a day or longer, and so, of course, that's going to encompass a cycle of evening and then morning. But we're working in what context? What story? Okay, so we've got, seemingly, he is pronouncing judgment against Assyria, but he is setting that against the backdrop of another story. We've already established that other story is what? The Exodus story, right? Coming out of Egypt, going to Sinai. So if we're working in that framework then, what holy festival happens around that time? What commemorates that every single year? Passover, right? So, it's not named, but it does begin at twilight, right? And he talks about them, like one who walks to the music of a flute, going to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel. So after they leave Egypt, where is the next real stop on the map? Sinai, right? So during that time, of course, water is cold from the rock as they journey to the mountain of Yahweh. And the reason why I bring that out is because what was just said in the section that we were reading to a second ago. The land seemingly is going to transform, and now they're going to have what coming out of the ground? Water. Streams of water flowing from every high hill and every mountain. The Lord will reveal his striking arm in angry wrath, a flame of consuming fire and driving rain, a torrent, hailstones, right? I mean, all of this imagery would bring us back to what story then? If we just read that verse alone by itself, free from the rest of this, where have we seen fire, hailstones being revealed by God's arm as he strikes out in wrath against somebody? Is that not one of the plagues? Right, exactly. He will strike with a rod. Again, just as he had spoken of Assyria doing the very same thing. Assyria is the rod of God's judgment, but now he will strike them with the rod, which takes us back to Isaiah 10 when he said he would do that. Therefore the Lord of armies says this, my people who dwell in Zion do not fear Assyria. Though they strike you with a rod and raise their staff over you as the Egyptians did, in just a little while my wrath will be spent and my anger will turn to their destruction instead. Topheth is ready. Where is Topheth? It's outside the southern wall of Jerusalem. Why is this important? Kings and other people who come to venerate the God who they worship there are passing their children through the sight, the fire, into the arms of Molech to be taken away, right? So it's, in a sense, a funeral pyre, because where the baby is coming into this ceremony alive, of course, they're going to be consumed, and ultimately they will die. But to say, indeed, Topheth has been made ready for the king for a long time. Its funeral pyre is deep and wide, with plenty of wood and fire. If up to this moment, from verse 27 till now, we've been talking about Assyria, not Judah, then whose king is in mind? Assyria. So if we're talking about Sennacherib, is it possible that Sennacherib is going to die? Well, he ultimately will. If we go back and we appreciate the totality of the story, what happens? Sennacherib, after he sends Rabshakeh, Tartan, and Rabsaris to the city, he follows up behind them as he polishes off Lachish. Once he gets there, he arrays his massive army. Angel of the Lord comes, destroys 185,000, and then Sennacherib goes home, right? He doesn't die there. But what does the writer of Kings say happens to Sennacherib once he goes home? He goes to worship in the temple of his God, and then 2 of his sons come and do what? So even though he doesn't die here, nonetheless, the story does end as it's pictured in Kings with his death, the funeral pyre. So as if to say, coming against Jerusalem is the very thing that's signing his death warrant in the end. So with that, it's a lot. We talked about quite a few things in 29 and 30, but if we're going to sum it all up, I would sum it all up in simply saying this. What we're looking at here, again, is God readdressing the fact that Judah is acting like a wild, braying donkey that refuses to be broken. Stubborn as can be, but in the end, God will ultimately break as he humiliates her, to then reform her and make something new of her. He assures her through the words of his prophet, who has access into God's divine counsel and hears and knows God's plans, as he relays this information to the people, that while God knows that their sense of what they think is wise is utter, complete folly, and their foolishness will lead to their almost obliteration, he is going to let these things play out for the sake of their ultimate good, because they need these things to play out to realize that they have no rock or refuge but God. And there was never anyone they possibly could look to or lean on other than him, because everyone else has not only let them down, they have let themselves down and let the God they promised to worship exclusively down. And they are in no way, shape, or form deserving of his mercies, but yet he is not devoid of them, nor will he starve them of them. He is going to continue to pour them out abundantly, but it will come at a price. Their complete, total reconstitution and transformation. But that will become something so beautiful and glorious that they can't even begin to conceptualize what that will be. He uses the very things that the story of Scripture starts off with to try to frame it up for them for what that will look like when it's all done. So, any concluding questions or comments?
It's just building up right now.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, because we're about to get to the actual showdown when we enter into this historical corridor and we go through almost the exact same words that the writer of Kings gives us, with some subtle differences, when Sennacherib does come against Judah, and we have the playing out of those events with Hezekiah and Isaiah and whatnot.
So are these, in chapter 30, written before or after?
It's possible it could have been written after the siege of Assyria, but the thing then would be the question about how do you write about divinely inspired events that only God has privy knowledge of, and of course is giving access to someone, namely a prophet, that he wants to share these with his people.
Let me re-ask that. Chapter 30, was it, did Israel receive, obviously not, but was this chapter 30 given to Israel prior to Assyria?
I would say maybe in parts, because that's just it. You know, one of the leading theories behind this is that many of these judgment and redemption cycles that we have in these words are parts from other oracles, in which maybe it's a very long and drawn out sermon in which Isaiah is only drilling down the carnage of judgment, right? And then another.
It sounds like, because you know Assyria is not the purveyor. They're not the ones giving them these. They're not implementing these judgments that we just went through.
Right.
In 30 on Israel. That comes later.
Exactly.
From Syria. So
Right.
perhaps, yeah.
At least not in totality, right? And so maybe there's a long and drawn out sermon on the redemption that God is going to bring and the salvation that he will laud on them. But they are breaking it up into smaller pieces and reforming these sermons to make it look like it's just a banter back and forth between the two. That's a theory. There's no way to prove that, because the oldest copies we have of these works have it laid out exactly like this. And so with that in mind then, we would have to assume this is the way Israel has always understood or had it framed up for them.